Okay, so here's something that genuinely messes with my head every time I think about it. When people talk about World War II, and specifically when they talk about the Soviet Union in World War II, the conversation always kind of lands in the same place, right? Tanks. The Soviets built a lot of tanks. They had a lot of soldiers. They threw everything at the Germans, and eventually, through sheer numbers, they won. And that's not wrong exactly, but it's missing something enormous, something that honestly, I think might be one of the most insane things human beings have ever done. And almost nobody talks about it. Because before the Soviets could build all those tanks, before they could arm all those soldiers, before any of that could happen, they had to do something that sounds fake. It sounds like something out of a movie that you'd watch and go, yeah, okay, that's a bit much. They moved their entire civilization. Not metaphorically, not like, oh, they shifted their focus eastward. No, I mean they physically, literally dismantled their factories. We're talking the nuts and bolts, the actual machines, the concrete foundations. They put all of it onto trains and they moved it 2,000 miles east into Siberia, into the Ural Mountains, into places where in winter it hits minus 40 degrees and there's nothing there. No buildings, no roads, sometimes no people. And they did it while the German army was right behind them. That's what we're talking about today. All right, so let me back up and give you the context, because this doesn't make sense unless you understand what the Soviet Union looked like in 1941. So the Soviet Union, the USSR, the communist state that Russia was part of, it was this massive country, biggest country in the world, stretched from Eastern Europe all the way across to the Pacific Ocean, just incomprehensibly large. But here's the thing people don't realize. Even though the country was enormous, almost everything that mattered, the industry, the factories, the population centers, was concentrated in the western part, specifically in Ukraine, in Belarus, in western Russia, cities like Kyiv, Minsk, Leningrad, which is now St. Petersburg, and Moscow. And when I say industry, I want to be really specific about what that means because it matters for the rest of the story. By 1941, Stalin, the Soviet leader, had spent about 15 years doing something called industrialization. Basically, the Soviet Union had been a mostly agricultural country. Lots of farmers, not a lot of factories. And Stalin decided, through some absolutely brutal policies, I mean, we're talking forced labor, famine, millions of people dying. He decided to transform the country into an industrial powerhouse. And by 1941, he'd actually done it. The Soviet Union was producing steel, machinery, weapons, aircraft, vehicles, all of it. They'd built these enormous factory complexes, some of them employing tens of thousands of workers in a single facility. But almost all of those factories were in the West. Close to Europe, close to Germany. And that's about to become the biggest problem imaginable. June 22nd, 1941, Operation Barbarossa. This is when Nazi Germany invades the Soviet Union. And I need you to understand the scale of this because it directly explains why the Soviets had to do what they did. This was the largest military invasion in human history, and I don't say that for dramatic effect. It literally was. 3 million German soldiers, 600,000 vehicles, thousands of tanks and aircraft, all of them pouring across the Soviet border on a front line that stretched over 1,000 miles. And the Soviets? They were caught off guard. Now, that's a whole other story. Stalin had actually received intelligence warnings that this was coming, and he ignored them, which is just... Anyway, the point is, the Soviet military was not ready, and the Germans advanced fast, terrifyingly fast. In the first few weeks alone, the Wehrmacht, that's the German military, they pushed hundreds of miles into Soviet territory. They were encircling entire Soviet armies. Hundreds of thousands of Soviet soldiers were being captured or killed in these massive encirclement battles. Cities were falling. It was an absolute catastrophe. And here's the part that connects to our story. As the Germans advanced, they were heading straight toward all of those factories, all of that industry that Stalin had spent 15 years building. the steel mills, the tank factories, the ammunition plants, the aircraft production facilities. All of it was sitting right in the path of the German advance. If the Germans captured or destroyed that industrial capacity, it was over, just done. You can't fight a modern war without factories. You can't build tanks without steel mills. You can't make ammunition without chemical plants. The Soviet Union would have been reduced to a country with millions of soldiers and nothing to arm them with. So, somebody had to make a decision, and they had to make it fast. On June 24th, 2 days after the invasion started, the Soviet government created something called the Council for Evacuation. And this is where it starts to get unbelievable. The man put in charge was a guy named Nikolai Shvernik, but the real driving force behind the whole operation was people like Alexei Kosygin, who would later become the Soviet premier. These guys had one job: get everything out of the West and move it east. Everything, not just military equipment, everything. And when I say everything, I want you to picture what that actually means on the ground. Imagine a massive steel factory. I'm talking a facility that covers acres of land with blast furnaces that are multiple stories tall, rolling mills that are hundreds of feet long, generators, electrical systems, cranes, all of it bolted down, wired in, connected to water supplies and power grids and rail networks. Now, imagine somebody telling you, take it apart. All of it. Every machine, every motor, every belt, every gear. Label it, crate it, and load it onto a train, and send it 2,000 miles east. You have about 2 weeks before the Germans get here. Oh, and you also need to send the workers and their families, because someone needs to actually know how to put this stuff back together and run it on the other end. That is what happened at over 1,500 factories simultaneously. The logistics of that alone make my brain hurt. So let me walk you through what this actually looked like, because the details are where it gets really real. Workers, and we're talking everybody, men, women, teenagers, they would work around the clock disassembling equipment, literally 24 hours a day in shifts. They'd use chalk or paint to mark every single piece so they'd know how to reassemble it. Some of these machines weighed tons. They didn't always have proper cranes. Sometimes they're using wooden ramps and manual labor to slide multi-ton pieces of equipment onto rail cars. And while they're doing this, they can hear artillery in the distance. Sometimes German planes are bombing the rail yards. Sometimes the factory itself is under air attack, while people are still inside it pulling machines off the floor. There's this account from a factory in Ukraine, I think it was in Zaporizhia, where workers were dismantling equipment on one side of the facility while German shells were literally hitting the other side. They just kept working, because what else are you going to do? If you stop, the machines fall to the Germans, and then nobody has weapons. The trains themselves were another nightmare. The Soviet rail network was being absolutely hammered. German planes were targeting rail lines, bridges, junctions, anything to disrupt the movement. So these evacuation trains are sharing tracks with military trains, moving troops and supplies to the front. Everything is competing for the same limited rail capacity. There are traffic jams of trains, massive bottlenecks at key junctions. And the trains weren't comfortable passenger cars. Most of the workers and their families were loaded into freight cars, open freight cars sometimes, in the middle of what was about to become one of the coldest Russian winters in memory. People froze, people starved on these trains, children died. It was absolutely harrowing. But they kept going, because there was nowhere else to go. Now, here's the part that I think really doesn't get enough attention: the destination. These factories weren't being moved to other cities with existing infrastructure. A lot of them were being sent to places in the Ural Mountains, in Kazakhstan, in western Siberia, places like Magnitogorsk, Chelyabinsk, Sverdlovsk, Novosibirsk, Tashkent. And some of these places had some existing industry, sure. Magnitogorsk had a big steel plant that was built in the 1930s, but many of the specific locations where factories were being reassembled, there was nothing there. Open steppe, frozen ground, maybe a rail siding, and that's it. And they did it while the German army was right behind them. So picture this: a train arrives carrying the dismantled pieces of a tank factory. It's November, it's -20, -30, and the ground is frozen solid. And workers, and we're talking the same workers who dismantled the factory back west, have to get off the train and start rebuilding the factory, right there in the open air. They often didn't have buildings ready. They would start putting machines on concrete pads, if they could pour concrete in the freezing cold, which, by the way, is its own engineering nightmare because concrete doesn't cure properly in extreme cold. Sometimes they'd set up machines under open sky and literally build the walls and roof around them while the machines were already running. There's this famous detail about the tank factories in Chelyabinsk, the city that became known as Tankograd, literally Tank City. Multiple tank and tractor factories from the western USSR were evacuated there and merged into one gigantic production complex. And they had some of the machines running and producing tank parts within weeks of arriving. Weeks! Before the buildings were even finished. Workers are assembling T-34 tanks, one of the most important tanks of the entire war, with snow blowing in through gaps in the walls that haven't been completed yet. Women and teenagers made up a huge portion of the workforce, by the way, because the men were at the front, fighting, dying in enormous numbers. So the people performing this industrial miracle were largely women, older men, and kids who should have been in school. They worked 12, 14, 16-hour shifts. They slept in dugouts, in tents, in hastily thrown together barracks. The food was terrible, and there wasn't enough of it, but they kept producing. And I think that's the part that gets me. It's not just the moving of the factories, which is insane enough. It's the human cost and the human will behind it. These were people who had every reason to give up. Their homes were destroyed, their families were scattered or dead, they were freezing and starving in the middle of nowhere, and they just built an entire industrial civilization from scratch in months. Let me give you some numbers, because I think numbers help make this real. Between July and November of 1941, so roughly 5 months, the Soviets evacuated approximately 1,500 major industrial enterprises, 1,500 factories, moved east. They moved an estimated 16.5 million people. That's more than the entire population of many countries. 16.5 million human beings relocated thousands of miles. They used about 1.5 million rail car loads of equipment, materials, and supplies. Try to imagine 1.5 million train cars. If you line them up end to end, I don't even know how far that would stretch. Thousands of miles of train cars. And here's the really staggering part. By mid-1942, so less than a year after this evacuation began, Soviet industrial production in the East was not just recovering, it was exceeding pre-war levels for certain types of military equipment. They were producing more tanks, more aircraft, more ammunition than they had been before the Germans invaded. More than before. Let that sink in for a second. They dismantled their entire industrial base, moved it 2,000 miles during a catastrophic military defeat, rebuilt it in frozen wilderness, and within months they were outproducing what they'd had before. The T-34 tank? They were rolling those out by the thousands from these relocated factories. The Katyusha rocket launcher, the famous one the Germans called Stalin's organ because of the sound it made, built in relocated factories. The IL-2 Stormovik ground attack aircraft, probably the most produced military aircraft in history, relocated factories. Everything that eventually enabled the Soviet Union to push the Germans back, to fight at Stalingrad, to break through at Kursk, to eventually march all the way to Berlin, all of that was built with machines that had been pulled out of factories in Ukraine and Western Russia, loaded onto trains, and reassembled by exhausted, freezing people in the Urals. Now, I want to be honest about something, because I think it's important for understanding the full picture. This wasn't a purely heroic story. Nothing with the Soviet Union under Stalin ever is. The evacuation was often chaotic. Decisions about what to prioritize were sometimes made badly. There were factories that didn't get evacuated in time and were captured by the Germans. There were factories that were evacuated, but the equipment arrived damaged or incomplete. There were workers who were essentially forced to relocate at gunpoint. This was a totalitarian state, remember. You didn't get a choice. You went where you were told, or you were treated as a saboteur or a deserter, and in Stalin's Soviet Union, that could mean being shot. The conditions at the new factory sites were genuinely horrific. People died from cold, from exhaustion, from malnutrition. The housing, if you can call it that, was completely inadequate. Medical care was virtually non-existent. Workplace accidents were common because everything was rushed, and safety was not even a consideration when the alternative was losing the war. And there's the broader question of why was this necessary in the first place? Part of the reason the Soviets were in this situation was because of Stalin's own catastrophic mistakes. His purges of the military leadership in the late 1930s, where he had many of his best generals arrested and executed because he was paranoid, had left the Soviet military badly weakened. His refusal to believe intelligence warnings about the German invasion meant the country was unprepared. The concentration of industry in the West was a known vulnerability that hadn't been adequately addressed. So this is both a story of extraordinary human achievement and a story of extraordinary human suffering, much of it needless. Both of those things are true at the same time. But here's why I think this matters. Here's why I think this story deserves to be better known. When we talk about World War II, we tend to tell it as a story of battles: Stalingrad, D-Day, Midway, Kursk. And those battles matter, obviously they matter. But battles are fought with weapons, and weapons are built in factories, and those factories have to exist somewhere. The Great Evacuation, or the evacuation of industry, as it's sometimes called in Russian sources, is arguably one of the most decisive events of the entire Second World War. Not a battle, not a military operation, a logistical operation, an industrial operation. If it had failed, if the Soviets hadn't gotten those factories in time, the Soviet Union almost certainly could not have sustained the war effort. And if the Soviet Union falls, if Germany doesn't have to fight on the Eastern Front anymore, the entire trajectory of the war changes. Everything changes. And it was done by ordinary people, factory workers, train drivers, engineers, teenagers, mothers with children strapped to their backs working assembly lines in buildings without walls in the middle of a Siberian winter. I think about that sometimes. I think about what it must have been like to be one of those people, to be standing in a half-built factory in Chelyabinsk in December 1941, assembling tank parts with your bare hands going numb, knowing that your home doesn't exist anymore, knowing that the soldiers who are going to use this tank might include your husband or your brother or your son, knowing that if you stop working, all of it was for nothing. That's not a story about tanks. That's not a story about military strategy. That's a story about what people are capable of when everything falls apart and they decide somehow to keep going anyway. And I think that's worth knowing about. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.